Welcome to the All Facts Matter podcast, where we push back against corporate media propaganda with facts, evidence, and data. I'm Peter, the author of All Facts Matter. Let's begin. Vladimir Putin's hyperbolic reaction to Ukraine's latest drone strike deep within Russian territory is but the latest demonstration of how Russia's greatest liability is none other than Vladimir Putin himself. For all his nationalistic and even jingoistic bluster, Putin's dogged insistence on ever more war is writing metaphorical checks that Russia is finding increasingly difficult to cash. As the war in Ukraine nears the completion of its third year, eventually Russians will have no choice but to confront the eternal question which hovers over all war. How much blood and treasure can Russia afford to pay? By now, the cycle has become disturbingly routine. Ukraine launches a drone strike deep into Russian territory, after which it announces the attack, often punctuating his disapproval with a missile and drone barrage over Ukraine. This latest attack came on Saturday against some high-rise buildings in the Russian city of Kazan, which is located in the oil-rich Republic of Tatarstan, which is over 600 miles from the Ukraine border. And it's over 500 miles east of Moscow. Now, this proves once again that Ukrainian drones are pretty much able to go wherever they want inside of Russia. Putin has not found a countermeasure which stops Ukrainian drones from penetrating to any city that the drones themselves are capable of reaching. Kazan is 500 miles east of Moscow. That is about as far away from the Ukrainian border as you might want to get, and Ukraine can reach out and touch it. And that's what this latest drone strike proves. Now, speaking to the Tatarstan leader on Sunday, Putin showed no awareness or was not deterred by this ability of Ukraine to penetrate deep into Russian territory at will. Instead, he continued on with his usual bluster and vowed, once again, a harsh retaliation for the attack, vowing that whoever and however much they try to destroy, they will face many times more destruction themselves and will regret what they are trying to do in our country. The whoever, of course, is Ukraine. Now, as Putin was uttering that bombast, Ukraine was carrying out another drone attack. Only this one was against an oil terminal, the Stanley Sonoy Kon oil terminal in the Oryol Oblast, which is closer to the front lines here in Kursk. This was a much more tactical strike, aiming to disrupt fuel supplies that ostensibly would be heading to the Russian forces, very likely in the Kursk region. Now, we should bear in mind, though, that all of these drone strikes are all a part of a war that began when Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. What was ostensibly supposed to be a special military operation of relatively short duration has instead devolved into a largely stalemated and very bloody war of attrition. And no matter how one views the geopolitical situation in Eastern Europe, regardless of whether one views the conflict as the product of a militaristic posturing by Putin or a reckless and largely corrupt NATO expansion effort designed to surround Russia, the practical consequences of war emerge not from the motives or the reasons, but from that choice to actually go to war. And even as we concede the obvious that NATO is, first and foremost, an anti-Russia military alliance, and it is, we must also concede that the decision to invade Ukraine was solely Vladimir Putin's. There was no gun held to Putin's head. There was no imminent crisis. There was no, there were no troops massed on Russia's border. It was Russian troops that were massed on Ukraine's border. And the choice to send those troops across the border was always Putin's, and Putin's alone. Now, it is scarcely remarkable to note that wars are costly, and the war in Ukraine has been no exception. And it was predictable even before Putin ordered his soldiers across the border into Ukraine that this war would be an expensive proposition for everybody. It was something I noted at the time. And 3 years on, this war has been extremely expensive for Russia and even more wasteful. Now, note, I will be doing a separate examination of the costs of the war as they affect Europe. Suffice it to say, for now, Europe's situation in this regard is no better than Russia's. But in this presentation, I am focusing on the impacts on Russia. Now, just how wasteful this war for Russia has been is made immediately clear when we consider how little the front lines have shifted over the course of the year. Russia has suffered absolutely horrific casualty rates over the past year. Literally, thousands of soldiers are casualties every single day. And yet, the overall battle lines in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, haven't shifted that much. This was what the front lines looked like on January 1, 2024. And this is where the front line stood at the end of last week. Not a lot of progress. This salient, which is just north of Kharkov, is the bulk of what Russia has achieved over the course of the year. With those military gains, Russia is estimated to have suffered over 125,000 casualties in just September, October, and November alone. Russia is reported to have lost as many as 2,200 soldiers in a single day, and seems determined to close out 2024 by repeatedly setting new records for most casualties suffered in a single day. You have to go back to either of the two world wars of the 20th century to find casualties figures of comparable magnitude. Now, if the scale of Russian deaths and Russian casualties in the war have resonated with Putin, he appears to hide it rather well. In a year-end media address, he managed to continue his bravado and bluster against NATO, going so far as to issue an open challenge to NATO for a missile duel. Yes, he actually challenged NATO to a missile duel. His proposal is that the West, NATO presumably, would pick a target in Kyiv, surround it with all of NATO's best air defense weapons, and Putin would then take out that target with Russia's new Oreshnik hypersonic missile. Putin called it an experiment, a high-tech duel of the 21st century. And he was confident that Western anti-missile defenses couldn't stop the Oreshnik, and he's ready to play. He's ready to play ball with us. He's ready to give this duel a try. Now, it's understandable why Putin is directing his remarks against NATO. While this war is being fought on Ukrainian soil, in geopolitical terms, this war has always been a contest between NATO and the Western powers on the one hand, and Russia on the other. And that has always been the reality of this conflict. And the military war of attrition in Ukraine has been matched with an economic war of attrition between the European Union and Russia. And both sides are getting battered in the economic war, just as Ukraine and Russia are getting battered in the military war. And the European Union and Russia have continued to batter each other ever since the war began. Now, bizarrely, Putin seems almost as undeterred by the economic costs of the war as he has been by the human casualties. In the same media address where he challenged NATO to a missile duel, he made the bizarre assertion that Russia is somehow stronger for the war. Now, this, of course, is complete nonsense. War weakens nations. Throughout the entirety of human history, there has never been a nation made stronger by war. Now, despite Putin's bombastic assertions that Russia is stronger, he did nevertheless concede that inflation is on the rise in Russia, despite the draconian interventions of the Russian central bank trying to keep inflation under control and prevent hyperinflation. However, there's no denying that the war in Ukraine has imposed a terrible cost on the Russian economy. Just a quick glance at the Moscow Stock Exchange over the past few years shows just how much of a beating Russian businesses have taken as a consequence of the war. By the fall of 2022, the MOEX index of Russian traded stocks had fallen by more than 50% from its pre-war high. And while it has recovered somewhat since then, it's still down over 35% of that pre-war high. Now, that economic pain is being felt across the whole of the Russian economy. Russia endured a full year of economic contraction once the war began, both because of the war itself and because of sanctions that were swiftly imposed by the EU and G7 countries. And even transitioning to a wartime economy has not brought the Russian economy back to levels of growth that it briefly enjoyed before the war. It's having year-on-year growth of about 3% over the last couple of months, and it was having year-on-year growth of 5 and close to 6% prior to that, prior to the war. Now, Russia's economy has never been a powerhouse of economic resiliency, but the war has definitely not helped in that regard. Now, while the manufacturing sector has definitely gained as a result of the war, mainly due to the focused output of war material, even those gains have been somewhat less than one would expect given the magnitude of the war waging in Ukraine. By the end of 2023, manufacturing GDP in Russia was up around about 5.5 trillion rubles. But just before the war, it was at 5 trillion rubles. So it hasn't really gained that much. Not yet. In a transition to a wartime economy, you would have expected by the end of 2023 that the manufacturing GDP would be well north of 6 trillion rubles. And it's not. Putin's bluster notwithstanding, Russia has been battered and bruised by this war in Ukraine. And it's going to take an even greater battering and bruising the longer this war drags on. The cost to the Russian people of this war is easily seen in the wartime inflation that is steadily creeping further and further and further into the Russian economy. Now, this is fairly typical. This is the consequence of converting a nation over to a war footing. When you have massive expenditures for implements of war coupled with a relative scarcity of consumer goods, that invariably is going to produce significant distortion in consumer prices in the form of ever-rising inflation. Now, the Russian central bank was successful in preventing hyperinflation early on. They were able to stop the inflation rate from getting out of control and getting it back down to under 10% by the end of 2022. But over the past 18 months, that inflation has steadily returned to Russia. And that inflation is steadily getting worse. When the month-on-month inflation rate doubles in a single month, which it did going from October to November, that's not good for the economy. That is a sign that inflation is on the verge of spiraling out of control. And if this trend continues, it's going to, then runaway hyperinflation is going to be the result. And that is happening despite the Russian central bank pushing interest rates up to 21%. Rates were already up at 18% or at 15%, 16% around the summer, and inflation still went up. And the central bank responded by pushing rates up to 21%, and inflation went even higher. Indeed, it's kind of surprising that the Russian central bank held the interest rates at 21% instead of pushing it up to 23%, as many economists had projected they would. And if inflation continues next year, the central bank may be forced to. Yeah. Interest rates are spiraling up, inflation is spiraling up, and very soon both may be spiraling out of control for Russia. And perhaps the most dire consequence of the war and attrition in Ukraine is the damage it's doing to the Russian ruble. I'm going to borrow a bit of Joe Biden's bombastic rhetoric about Russia and point out that the ruble really is becoming rubble. I mean, what other conclusion can we draw from the fact that the ruble has depreciated against the Chinese yuan by some 10% in just the past year alone? And this decline is by far the most devastating for Russia because China has become Russia's principal trading partner. As a result of sanctions imposed by the EU as a consequence of Putin invading Ukraine, Europe, the European Union, which was Russia's principal trading partner, has been supplanted by China. But the Russian ruble has lost 10% of its value in just the past year alone against the Chinese yuan. And that means that Chinese goods, Chinese imports, which are the bulk of imports to Russia right now, are 10% more expensive than they were a year ago. But it's not just China. The ruble has depreciated 12% against the US dollar, which gives a sense of how the ruble is faring globally. Now, the only reason that in truth, the only reason that the ruble didn't decline 12% against the yuan is because the Chinese yuan has also lost about 2% against the US dollar. If the Chinese yuan had held its own against the dollar, the ruble would have fallen further against the yuan. But this is also a problem for Russia. Because, again, China is Russia's principal trading partner. But China is mired in its own economic problems right now, as evidenced by the fact that the yuan has lost 2% of its value against the dollar over the past year. And having a nation like Russia, which is in the middle of a war and therefore is going to have a voracious appetite for imports of whatever it can get, that trading partner is not sufficient to pull China out of its economic doldrums. Its economic crisis is not being sufficiently alleviated or sufficiently mitigated by their trading relationship with Russia. And that's going to create a question for China. How long is China willing to stand beside Russia in the face of opposition from the European Union and the United States if they're not getting economic benefit or sufficient economic benefit from that relationship? How much cost is China willing to absorb in order to stand beside Russia? That's the question that China is having to ask itself right now because of China's economic problems. And what the war has done, ultimately, is exacerbate just how weak the ruble is globally. Since 2019, the ruble has declined some 35% against the Chinese yuan. And while a considerable portion of that decline occurred before the war began, there's no getting around the fact that the ruble is now significantly weaker than it was at the start of the war. Whatever else may be said about the state of the Russian economy, the one thing which may not realistically be said is that the Russian economy is in any way stronger as a result of the war. When Putin says that, he is just full of malarkey. Russia is not stronger as a result of this war. Russia is weaker. Russia is demonstrably weaker in multiple areas. Now, perversely, as much as the war has had ginormous costs for Russia, and is going to continue to have ginormous costs for Russia, by putting Russia on a wartime footing, Putin faces another economic challenge when Russia finally does sue for peace. And that is the economic challenge of peace. The economic challenge of peace after war is that of transition. And rarely is that transition gentle or easy. Rather, it's abrupt. Once the guns fall silent, the demand for more guns and more munitions and more war production immediately ceases, or very nearly so. At the same time, the production of civilian consumer goods is slow to ramp back up again. And the result is an inevitable economic peacetime shock. Now, nominally, the Russian economy has grown as a result of the war. It went from just over 1.7 trillion rubles to over roughly about 2.2 trillion rubles in 2022, and it's even now at right above 1.9 trillion rubles. But much of this growth has come because of government demand for war material. And when peace does come, that demand goes away. And that means that Russia is facing an inevitable economic contraction that is at least as great as the 11% contraction it endured in 2023 during its extended and quite painful transition to a wartime footing. Now, depending on how that peace takes shape and to what extent Russia can repair its relations with Europe, Russia may have to endure a contraction in the economy to 2020 levels or even further. A contraction of 35, 40, even 50% is not out of the question for Russia. And that's the consequence of suing for peace. That's the consequence of stopping the war, that contraction occurs. And a post-war economic contraction, that's not a hypothetical. That is established historical reality. When countries transition from war to peace, an economic contraction is part of the process. That was the case for the United States after the Civil War, after World War I, after World War II. It was the case for the United Kingdom after World War I. And about the only reason we wouldn't say that it's the case for the countries of Europe after World War II is because every economy in Europe after World War II was completely devastated and not functioning anyway. But that's what Putin is looking at once he sues for peace. There will be an economic contraction. Now, is Putin prepared for that transition? Is he prepared for the economic dislocation that must come as a consequence of seeking peace? There's no way to know for certain. But it is certain that Putin's current level of bluster and his desire to project strength both internally and externally shows no indication of even an awareness of such challenges once peace arrives. Yet, as history has shown time and again, the longer war drags on, the greater the cost of transitioning back to peace. The longer Russia remains mired in an attritional war in Ukraine, the greater its cost will be when at last peace comes and the guns fall silent. War is a costly undertaking, and attritional warfare is especially costly. By every measure, such is an horrific shedding of national blood and treasure. This war is costing Russia dearly. This war is costing Ukraine dearly. This war is costing Europe dearly. And this war will continue to cost Russia dearly. And even ending the war is going to cost Russia dearly. Can such costs ever be justified? If one accepts Putin's rationale that the war is existential for Russia, perhaps. Depicting a war in existential terms removes most other alternatives from the table, including peace. When one frames the choices as war or extinction, questions of costs are largely set aside. Yet, while framing the war in Ukraine as an existential battle for Russia might set aside questions about the costs of this war, that framing cannot set aside the costs themselves. Casualties happen in war, existential crisis or not. Economic consequences arise from war, existential crisis or not. The pressures of inflation, of scarcity and wartime rationing, of manpower dislocation, these arise because of the demands governments make on a nation in order to prosecute a war, existential crisis or not. There is a cost to war, and there is a cost to ending war, and neither cost can be avoided. And both costs are made greater the longer war is extended. Right now, Putin seems willing to extend the war in Ukraine. The longer he does, the more the Russian people will have to pay for that war. And the more the Russian people will have to pay to transition from war to peace. Somehow, I doubt the Russian people are all that enthusiastic about having to pay either for the war or for the peace. Not that Putin is giving them any say in the matter. And that concludes this presentation. I hope you found this podcast helpful and informative. Please like it and share this with your friends. Word of mouth is how I publicize my work. Please also consider making a one-time donation or becoming a paid subscriber to All Facts Matter. Your support is what keeps this work going, and I greatly appreciate all of my subscribers. Without you, this work would have no meaning. I encourage everyone to be especially generous with feedback. Leave a word or two in the comment section so that we can keep the discussion going and that we may learn from each other. Thank you all for listening, and have a nice day.